The birth of the Renaissance, Giotto and the dawn of realism. Imagine a world drained of color and emotion, not literally, of course, but artistically. For 1,000 years, the visual story of Western civilization had been a flattened golden tableau. Saints and saviors floated on abstract backgrounds, their expressions fixed, their bodies stiff. Art was a magnificent symbol, a revered idea, but it wasn't a mirror of life. It lacked weight. It lacked shadow. It lacked us. Then, in the mud and clamor of late 13th century Italy, a shepherd boy named Giotto di Bondone picked up a piece of charcoal. With it, he didn't just draw, he performed a miracle. He made his figures breathe. He cast a shadow that would stretch across 6 centuries, a shadow that didn't obscure the light, but proved it was real. This isn't just the tale of a genius. It's the thrilling, tumultuous origin story of the Renaissance. It's the moment Europe woke up, blinked, and saw itself, flawed, fleshy, and magnificent for the very first time. The Shepherd and the Master. The year was roughly 1267. The place, a small country village near Florence called Vespiano. The air smelled of sheep, olives, and the perpetually damp earth of Tuscany. In this humble setting, a young boy, perhaps 9 or 10, was supposed to be watching his family's flock. Instead, he was hunched over a smooth slab of slate, his brow furrowed in concentration. His name, Giotto, was unremarkable. His talent was not. With a piece of charcoal gleaned from a spent fire, he wasn't drawing the stiff, formulaic sheep that adorned the illuminated manuscripts of the time. He was drawing the sheep in front of him, a clumsy ewe with a smudge of dirt on its nose, a nervous lamb with knobbly knees, their wool rendered not as a pattern, but as a textured mass of shadow and light. He was giving them volume, a simple, stunning reality that was utterly missing from the established Byzantine style that dominated religious art. One afternoon, a man of immense fame and even greater temper, the great painter Cimabue, whose name means ox-head or bull-headed, a testament to his stubborn artistic genius, was riding from Florence toward the Tuscan hills. Cimabue, whose name means ox-head or bull-headed, a testament to his stubborn artistic genius, was the leading light of the Florentine school. His work, while still rooted in the Byzantine tradition, was already pushing the boundaries, introducing a subtle grace and fluidity that his predecessors lacked. He was the reigning champion of the old world. Cimabue's journey was interrupted by the unusual sight of Giotto so engrossed in his drawing he hadn't noticed the prestigious entourage halt. Cimabue dismounted, intrigued. The story, now a legendary anecdote passed down by the 16th century biographer Giorgio Vasari, claims that Giotto was not just drawing sheep, but a fly so realistic on the nose of one of the sheep that Cimabue was momentarily fooled and tried to brush it away. Whether the fly was real or apocryphal, the genius was undeniable. Giotto, seeing his mistake, had created an image that tricked the eye, a profound break from the symbolic art of the past, an embrace of trompe l'oeil and pure observation. Cimabue, whose own artistic evolution was a relentless search for greater naturalism, recognized the lightning strike of talent. He saw not just a shepherd boy, but the future of painting. "Boy," Cimabue is said to have declared, his voice a surprising blend of gruffness and awe, "you will no longer draw on slates. You will draw on gold." And so, with a simple ride back to Florence, the history of Western art was irrevocably changed. Giotto became Cimabue's apprentice, exchanging the fields of Vespiano for the bustling, often brutal workshops of Florence. It was a baptism by fire, a rigorous education in mixing pigments, preparing frescoes, and mastering the demanding craft. But Giotto was a sponge. He didn't just mimic the master. He learned his techniques, only to immediately start dismantling the artistic rules they represented. The prison of the Byzantine. To understand Giotto's revolution, one must first grasp the visual world he inherited. For centuries, art was governed by the Byzantine tradition, imported from Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, and entrenched in the religious centers of Italy. This style was intentionally static, rigid, and two-dimensional. It was built on a theological premise that the human world was corrupt, and that depicting the divine world with too much realism would profane its perfection. Key characteristics of the Byzantine style included gold backgrounds, used not for luxury, but to symbolize the eternal, unearthly nature of heaven. Gold has no shadow, no real light source. It is pure, abstract radiance. Reverse perspective, sometimes employed to make distant objects appear larger, a technique that defied human optics and emphasized a spiritual rather than earthly viewpoint. Fixed expressions. Figures were typically portrayed with large, staring eyes and formulaic, almost mask-like expressions, meant to convey reverence or solemnity, not human emotion. Flat drapery. Robes and cloth were rendered in stylized, hard folds, looking less like fabric and more like geometric patterns. The body beneath was often completely lost. The masters of this era, like Cimabue and Duccio, were already struggling against these constraints, yearning for a visual language that felt more accessible, but it was Giotto who took the sledgehammer to the edifice. He was the first artist whose eye was not trained primarily by previous art, but by direct observation of the world. He saw people argue, laugh, grieve, and stand. He noticed how the light of the sun created deep pockets of shadow, how a heavy piece of cloth folded under its own weight, and how a human body shifted its weight to stand naturally. His great realization, the core principle that would define the Renaissance, was simple but earth-shattering. If God created the world, and if man was created in God's image, then to accurately and lovingly depict the beauty and reality of the world and the human form was not a sin, but an act of profound devotion. The sacred could be found not despite, but within the natural world. The Scrovegni Chapel, the human drama unfolds. Giotto's career blossomed quickly. His reputation for revolutionary realism spread like wildfire across the fragmented Italian peninsula. By the turn of the 14th century, he was commissioned for a work that would become his undisputed masterpiece and one of the most important landmarks in the history of art. The decoration of the Scrovegni Chapel, also known as the Arena Chapel, in Padua. The chapel was commissioned by Enrico Scrovegni, a wealthy Paduan banker whose father, a notorious usurer, moneylender, was so infamous that Dante Alighieri himself placed him in the seventh circle of hell in the Inferno. Enrico built the chapel as a private sanctuary, a magnificent, costly act of public atonement, a bid to buy his father, and perhaps himself, out of eternal damnation. Giotto was given the entire interior of the modest, barrel-vaulted chapel to work with, a perfect blank canvas. Between 1303 and 1305, he covered the walls with a breathtaking, continuous narrative series of frescoes depicting the lives of Joachim and Anna, Mary's parents, the life of the Virgin, and the life and passion of Christ. This wasn't just decoration, it was a fully immersive visual experience, a comic book for the soul, and a complete break from tradition. The chapel is not merely a collection of individual paintings, it is a unified, three-dimensional stage where sacred history is enacted by people who feel devastatingly real. Architecture of illusion. Giotto began by painting a faux architecture, marble panels, false niches, and illusionistic pilasters that framed the narrative scenes. This was his initial move to break the flat wall. He was essentially telling the viewer, the wall you are looking at is not a wall, it is a window into a real, deep space. This early use of architectural trompe l'oeil was a crucial step toward the systematic use of perspective that would define the High Renaissance a century later. The first great human emotions. Look at the famous panel, The Lamentation, the Mourning of Christ. Here is the moment where Giotto's revolutionary vision hits with full force. Christ's body, newly removed from the cross, lies in the foreground. It is the focal point, but it is not the only source of drama. Mary cradles his head with a look of agony that is utterly human and gut-wrenching. Look closer. Mary Magdalene. She doesn't just stand, she is hunched over Christ's feet, physically pressing her face to them in desperate grief.
The power of volume and light. Giotto's realism extended far beyond just the emotional landscape. It fundamentally altered how figures were rendered in 3 dimensions. This was the birth of pictorial space as we understand it today. In the Scrovegni Chapel, Giotto solved the centuries-old problem of making a figure seem solid, heavy, and present, what art historians call mass and volume. He achieved this through a revolutionary use of modeling and light source. The weight of humanity. Consider the panel, The Kiss of Judas. This is perhaps the moment of Christ's betrayal, yet Giotto transforms it into a swirling, claustrophobic drama centered on the terrifying intimacy of the kiss. Drapery is fabric. Giotto didn't paint the stylized zigzags of Byzantine robes. He painted heavy, woolen garments that respond to gravity and the movement of the body underneath. The folds are shaded or modeled with different tones of the same color, creating the illusion that the cloth curves around a real human form. You can feel the weight of the cloaks, the bulk of the bodies. This simple change made his figures look like people you could bump into on the street, not floating spirits. The light source. For the first time, Giotto treated light as if it were coming from a specific, single direction, likely from the real window in the chapel's arch. By subtly deepening the shadow on one side of a figure and highlighting the other, he created chiaroscuro, Italian for light-dark. This technique gives the figures roundness and pushes them away from the flat wall and into the viewer's space. The figure of Christ, wrapped in his heavy mantle, feels anchored to the ground. The confrontation. The central moment is a masterpiece of psychological intensity. Judas, whose face is painted with an ugly, porcine quality, a clear moral judgment, envelops Christ in his yellow cloak. Christ's gaze, calm and penetrating, meets the traitors with a quiet, devastating certainty. The 2 faces are the focus of a chaos of torches, spears, and helmeted soldiers. But the emotional conflict is utterly contained in that silent, eye-level confrontation. This was not merely a stylistic choice, it was a philosophical statement. By giving his figures weight, Giotto affirmed the value of the physical human body and the sensory world. He bridged the gap between the divine narrative and the viewer's tangible, lived experience. He was grounding heaven on earth.
The economic engine of the Florentine art. To truly understand the birth of the Renaissance through Giotto's eyes, an American audience must appreciate the powerful, materialistic engine driving this artistic change, Florentine commerce and banking. The shift from the abstract, otherworldly style of Byzantium to Giotto's tangible realism was not purely philosophical. It was deeply rooted in the economic explosion that made Florence the wealthiest city-state in Europe. The city was a hotbed of international trade, innovative banking, and aggressive capitalism, led by families like the Medici, the Bardi, and the Peruzzi. The banker's need for realism. The Byzantine style, with its flattened figures and endless gold, reflected a feudal society where value was concentrated in land and the spiritual authority of the church. But in 14th century Florence,
Power was in the hands of merchants who traded in tangible goods, wool, silk, coinage, and property. These new patrons saw the world differently. They were practical, numerate, and grounded in the material world. When they commissioned art, they wanted something that reflected their own values. Tangible wealth. A banker like Enrico Scrovegni, who paid Giotto lavishly for his chapel, wanted his investment to be seen as solid, real, and lasting, a tangible asset against spiritual debts. Giotto's figures, with their heavy robes and real volume, represented a kind of aesthetic solidity that appealed to the practical merchant class. Individual virtue. The rising merchant class was keen to distinguish itself through acts of conspicuous piety and philanthropy. They wanted their portraits and the saints they revered to look less like distant symbols and more like powerful, moral individuals, role models who were grounded in human experience. Giotto's psychological depth gave these figures the individualism and force of character that the new Florentine elite valued. Measurable space. The mathematical, measured space that Giotto began to develop and that would become perfect linear perspective later was essentially the visual language of the merchant. Bankers dealt in balance sheets, weights, and measures. They wanted art that used measurable, rational space, a direct contrast to the irrational, abstract space of the older style. Giotto's proto-perspective was an art of rational calculation. Giotto's success, therefore, was intertwined with the rise of a new class of patrons who preferred the reality of the balance sheet over the mysticism of the gold background. His art was, in a profound sense, the visual manifestation of early capitalism. Giotto the architect, the bell tower of Florence. Giotto's genius was not confined to a paintbrush. It was organizational and architectural. In 1334, recognizing his immense talent and reputation, the city government of Florence appointed Giotto as the capo maestro, or master builder, of the Florence Cathedral, the Duomo, and overseer of the city walls. This appointment was a testament to his status as a Renaissance man before the Renaissance truly began. An artist who could command stone and structure was one who had truly bridged the gap between manual craft and intellectual pursuit. His chief task was designing the campanile, or bell tower, which stands beside the Duomo today. While he only saw the first two registers of the structure completed before his death in 1337, his initial design was adhered to, with modifications, by his successor, Andrea Pisano. Giotto's campanile, a painted poem in stone. Giotto's design for the campanile is not just a building. It is a three-dimensional monument that embodies the aesthetic principles of his painting. Clarity and proportion. The tower rises in distinct, geometrically clear registers, demonstrating a logical, rational approach to form, a stark contrast to the intricate and often chaotic decoration of older Gothic towers. This same clarity defines the composition of his frescoes. Narrative reliefs. The lower levels of the tower are adorned with relief carvings, many based on Giotto's designs, depicting scenes of humanity's work, from the creation of man to the mechanical arts. These reliefs, like his paintings, celebrate human endeavor, labor, and skill, the very values of the Florentine mercantile class. It's a hymn to human achievement, an embodiment of humanism. Color and light. Giotto's plan, realized in part by his successors, used multicolored marble, white, green, and pink, to create a visual lightness that seems to defy the tower's immense height. He applied the principles of color and modeling from his painting to a massive architectural scale, giving the stone volume and texture. Giotto's architectural work cemented his legacy as the great Florentine intellectual and artist. He elevated the status of the architect-artist from simple builder to creative mastermind, a title that would later be claimed by Brunelleschi and Michelangelo. He was an artist whose vision encompassed both the drama of the single human face and the entire skyline of a revolutionary city. The path to the High Renaissance. Giotto's children. Giotto did not invent the Renaissance out of thin air, but he provided the foundational grammar. His impact is best measured by tracking the direct line of development that led from him to the giants of the 15th and 16th centuries, the period most often associated with the term Renaissance. The immediate successors, or the Trecento. After Giotto's death, his workshop students such as Taddeo Gaddi and Bernardo Daddi continued his tradition, applying his methods of modeling, spatial organization, and emotional realism. They spread the style across the Tuscan region and beyond, essentially standardizing the Giottoic approach. While their work often lacked the raw emotional power and inventive compositions of the master, they successfully codified the new visual language. However, the shadow of the Black Death, starting in 1348, temporarily threw art into a crisis. The unimaginable devastation led to a widespread fear of God's wrath. Patrons began to favor works that emphasized suffering, judgment, and intense, traditional piety, often returning to the gilded backgrounds and rigid didactic compositions that Giotto had rejected. This temporary shift is crucial to understanding the slow burn of the Renaissance. It wasn't a sudden explosion, but a flame that was almost extinguished and then had to be carefully nursed back to life. The true heir. Masaccio and the Scrovegni Chapel. The true rebirth came in the 1420s with Masaccio, or Tommaso di Ser Giovanni di Simone, a young Florentine artist who, along with the architect Brunelleschi and the sculptor Donatello, fully ushered in the early Renaissance. Masaccio looked back over the Gothic reaction directly to Giotto. Masaccio is often called the second father of the Renaissance. Why? Because he took Giotto's intuitive realism and infused it with the new mathematical precision of linear perspective which Brunelleschi had just formally developed. Look at Masaccio's masterpiece, the tribute money in the Scrovegni Chapel. Giotto's figures, now perspective. The figures of Christ and the apostles have the same massive, grounded sculptural volume that Giotto pioneered, but unlike Giotto's intuitive space, Masaccio's landscape and architecture recede perfectly into one distant vanishing point. Giotto's pathos, now intensified. In the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, Masaccio paints Adam and Eve with a raw, desperate shame, their bodies twisted in physical and spiritual agony. This direct, uncompromising depiction of intense human emotion is the direct emotional and psychological heir to Giotto's Lamentation. The figures scream with a pain that is real, not symbolic. Masaccio essentially said, Giotto was right. The figures must be real. Now let's make the space they inhabit scientifically real too. Giotto provided the weight and the heart. Masaccio provided the geometry and the structure.
The American Aesthetic Mirror. The story of Giotto's revolution speaks to a fundamental tension that exists in American culture, the balance between tradition and innovation. In the 14th century, Giotto was challenging an established religious tradition by prioritizing human experience and scientific observation. This is mirrored in the American tradition of transcendentalism and realism in the arts and literature, a constant urge to shed old European constraints and look at the American landscape and the common citizen with fresh, unvarnished eyes. From Byzantine to abstract expressionism. The aesthetic journey Giotto began is a cyclical one that continues into the modern era. The early Byzantine era, symbolism, art as religious code and abstract form. Giotto, realism, a sudden, radical shift to focus on the individual, the material world, and emotional truth. The Renaissance, classical idealism, the perfection of Giotto's realism through math and idealized beauty. Modern art, a return to abstraction. Eventually, artists like Picasso and Pollock abandoned photographic realism, not by ignoring Giotto's lessons, but by using them as a foundation from which to leap back into abstraction and conceptual art. The difference is that after Giotto, the choice to be abstract became a conscious artistic decision, not a default mode dictated by theology. Every painter who chooses to paint a realistic face, a believable body, or a landscape with true shadow owes a debt to Giotto. He gave artists the freedom to choose reality as their subject. Giotto's life embodies the foundational myth of Western success, the outsider, the self-made genius, the shepherd boy who dared to draw what he saw, not what he was told to see. He liberated the human figure, and in doing so, liberated the European mind to begin its long, complicated journey toward the Enlightenment. The technique of the revolution, fresco, and the human hand. Giotto's ability to create such astounding realism relied not just on his eye, but on his profound mastery of the medium itself, fresco painting. Fresco, which means fresh in Italian, involves painting pigments mixed with water onto a thin layer of wet plaster, the intonaco. As the plaster dries, the pigment chemically bonds with the lime, becoming a permanent part of the wall. This makes the art incredibly durable, which is why Giotto's colors are still vibrant 7 centuries later. But it also demands speed, precision, and immense planning. The discipline of the day. The process of painting a fresco panel was an intense race against time. The artist could only paint as much as he could complete in one working session before the plaster dried. This area is called a giornata, Italian for a day's work. Giotto's frescoes reveal the meticulous planning and structural discipline that went into his work, turning the demanding technique into an instrument of realism. Sinopia, the blueprint. Before the intonaco was applied, Giotto would sketch out the entire composition, often in reddish earth pigment, directly onto the rough plaster layer, arriccio. This preliminary drawing, known as the sinopia, established the figure's placement, scale, and the main architectural lines. It was here that he calculated the weight and balance of his composition. The overlap and the flow. By examining the boundaries of the giornate in the Scrovegni Chapel, art historians can track how Giotto's hand moved across the wall. He was systematic, often working from the top down and carefully coordinating the color palette for each day to ensure continuity. This discipline is the unsung hero of his dramatic narrative. It allowed the emotional flow of the story to remain unbroken. The speed of emotion. The rapid application required by fresco forced Giotto to paint with a confidence that stripped away unnecessary fussy detail, leaving only the essentials. This is part of what gives his faces their powerful impact. They are quick, broad studies of emotion, executed before the plaster could set. The tears, the furrowed brows, and the opened mouths were laid down with immediate, expressive force. This technical mastery underscores a key message for a modern audience. Innovation in art often requires mastery of the established craft. Giotto didn't break the rules until he had perfected the execution. He was a master builder as much as he was a visionary painter. The American Renaissance and the Enduring Vision. Giotto's legacy lives on, not just in museum galleries, but in the cultural DNA of every society that values realism and the narrative power of visual art. The American affinity for narrative clarity, from the grand, historical murals of the 19th century to the storytelling of cinema, is a direct, if distant, descendant of Giotto's innovations. From Florence to Hollywood. Consider the core elements of Giotto's work and how they form the bedrock of modern visual storytelling, particularly in the United States, a culture defined by its screen industries. Blocking, or composition. Giotto's use of compositional elements to guide the eye, like the sloping hill in the Lamentation, is the ancient ancestor of cinematic blocking, the strategic placement of actors and objects to create visual tension and direct the viewer's attention. Close-up, or psychological realism. Giotto's focus on the individualized suffering faces of his figures was the earliest artistic close-up. He understood that the most powerful drama is often found in the subtle, raw expression of a face. This insight is fundamental to performance and direction in film and television. Atmosphere and lighting, or chiaroscuro. Giotto's use of a defined light source and shadow, modeling, is the earliest form of creating atmosphere and mood through lighting, a technique perfected in film noirs and dramatic cinematography. He proved that shadow is just as important as light in defining reality. Giotto didn't just teach artists how to paint, he taught the world how to see and narrate in 3 dimensions. He moved the world from reading symbolic codes to watching a drama unfold. The simple shepherd's hand. The most astounding part of this entire epic is its sheer simplicity of origin. The towering achievement of the Renaissance, the era of Leonardo's science, Michelangelo's passion, and Raphael's grace, began with a young, unlettered shepherd boy drawing a realistic sheep on a slab of slate. Giotto's genius was his humility before nature. He had the clarity of vision to understand that the complexity and beauty of God's creation, the very texture of reality, was a worthy, perhaps the most worthy subject for art. He bypassed centuries of tradition with the power of his own personal observation. He laid down the first essential principle of humanism. The human being, in all their flesh, emotion, and dramatic circumstance, is the center of the story. When you stand today in the Scrovegni Chapel in Padua, Italy, surrounded by the 3-dimensional, grieving, and triumphant figures of Giotto's world, you are not just looking at a beautiful ancient church. You are looking at the origin point, the moment 1,000 years of spiritual abstraction ended, and the long, glorious chapter of human realism, the story of us, began. The shepherd's hand had reached across time, pulled the human spirit out of the golden ether, and grounded it firmly on the Tuscan earth, where it remains to this day.